Good morning, folks. I've been getting nostalgic for the 80s lately. I was born into the very early 80s, so I was starting to be able to form memories by about 1985. And, I remember Chernobyl. I remember the drought of 88. I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I experienced a little bit some of the 80s. I mean, not like, people who were in high school, but I did experience it. And I want to go go in depth about why the 80s was the best decade that America ever had and why it's never going to happen again. A decade like that not only won't but can't happen ever again. Now, first of all, a little bit of background. In there's 10 decades per century. Now, I submit to you that there are three defining decades of the 20th century, of the last century. And those decades were the 1940s, obviously because of the war, and after the war ended, it had a big impact on our economy. The 1960s, though I can't speak on that because I wasn't there. And then, of course, the 1980s. That was when I came into being and I experienced some of the 80s. And of course, I came of age in the 90s, but I was born in the very, very early 80s. And I would like to tell you why the 80s was the best decade ever and why that kind of decade can never happen again. Well, probably the first reason why it was one of the best decades was because it was it was still a time when Democrats and Republicans could work together. Today, all we know, I mean, my kid was born in 2008, and all he has ever known is political dysfunction. Democrats and Republicans are always at each other's throats. They hate each other, and there's nothing but political dysfunction today. But back in the 1980s, they could still work together. They could actually be friends. In fact, I believe when Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House in 1994, he used to play golf and with President Bill Clinton, and he and those two got along famously well. They were very good friends. And, despite the fact that Newt Gingrich was a Republican and Bill Clinton was a Democrat, they got along famously. That was the 90s was the last decade before our political system went to shit. Because it was after the 1990s that everything fell apart politically, but in the 1980s, the Democrats and Republicans could still work together. And, I obviously, with how young I was, I didn't care at the time, but now looking back, I really wish that we could bring that back. I would give anything to go back to the 80s because it was such a rich time, good culture. I mean, so there's even kids today who are, 16, 19, 20 years old who wish they had lived in the 80s because it was just such a good time. And it really was. It really was. And well, I'll mention why the 80s was the best more in future videos, but for now, just know, I mentioned the three defining decades of the last century, and one reason why the 80s was so good is, one reason is because it was one of the last decades where the Republicans and Democrats could work together and get along.